forget. All right. So welcome everyone to this final session of this incredible several-month run put on by Q and Microsoft as far as just bringing us together and learning together. I am honored that I have been a part of your journey these last many months. And so while I was planning for this session, I kind of was going through my regular slides and I had to set it aside because right now feels really heavy. I vacillate between feeling like I've got this, no problem, and to feeling really overwhelmed and not quite knowing, what I'm going to see on the news and what's playing out in our world. And for those of you who don't know, Kenosha, Wisconsin is about an hour away. I have a lot of friends in the school district there, and Kenosha is at the forefront of a lot of the thinking and the actions of what I'm doing and planning in my classroom. But I'm also sitting in kind of a little bit of anger and despair when it comes to, because, if not Kenosha, then it's just the next place and the next place and the next place. And here we are. For me, I just finished 2 of my 3 in-service days, and the work feels really big right now and feels really important. And so as I was preparing my slides yesterday, I had this moment of just going, you know what, maybe what we need right now is not a polished, put together presentation, but some more just kind of straight from the heart. So that's what I'm going to do. Please use the chat box as usual for whatever works for you and whatever you need. And feel free to ask questions, and I don't have quite as many slides as I normally do because I didn't have the words that I needed. So we'll see how this goes. And so as I think about the world right now, one of the biggest things that I've seen happen, right, is that we are hungry. A lot of people want to take on this world work. We want to go back to our classrooms and have hard conversations and bring our children and students along on this journey as we realize the systemic structures that have impeded the success for many children, or we continue the work that we have already been doing. But I keep thinking about how quickly we are to look for change in our classrooms and yet shy away from it in our own lives. How much easier it is for us to look at others and say, here's what you need to work on, and then forget to turn the mirror back to ourselves. And so while this quote says, make sure we change our classrooms first, I almost went back, this is an old quote, is to add on that, but before we even do that, make sure we change ourselves first. Before we plan for all of the work that we want students to dive into, make a plan for ourselves. And I don't mean all of the to-dos. I mean, I feel like my checklists have checklists right now, but really giving ourselves space to look the hard truth in the eye and go, what is my part in the systems that are standing in the way of children's success? But also, what can my role be to locally break down those systems? What can I do within the sphere of my control, and how can I unpack this myself? And whether it's because you're paying attention to the racial revolution and unrest that's happening here in the United States, or you're fighting in your own systemic battles wherever you're situated, we have to start with ourselves. But at the same time, we also have to love ourselves. And that's where my balance is hard at times, because I wake up thinking I haven't done enough, that I didn't plan enough, or I don't know what I'm doing because I'm not an expert. And yet within that journey and being willing to take those steps is the work that I need to do. I'm willing to take risks with my students because I truly need to model what it means to go on this journey of trying to be a part of the solution rather than another part of the problem. And so I think about the people that inspire me. And I know if you've been through any of my PD, I've brought these books up many times, but I cannot do any of the work that I do without the thoughts of others, and without others who have said, I'm not sure if this is what the world needs, but I'm going to speak my piece. And so I encourage you to look at your own professional development, to look at your own self-care and see whose voices you're paying attention to. In fact, I'll be vulnerable here. Earlier today, someone reached out and said, I need some experts that can really guide me in early childhood. And as I was giving the person names, because of course names popped into my head, I quickly realized how white my group was. And so if we can continually reflect on who are we listening to, who is within our circles of influence, then we can also see where the gaps are and allow ourselves to fill those gaps, hopefully, and learn from those who have walked on this path and who carry the emotional toll of what it means to put yourself out there and do this work so that others can have some major realizations. And so I know that I've brought this up before, but I keep coming back to this simple truth. What is the number one thing that students tell me to tell all of you when I say, what would you like me to tell the educators that I train? And so if you've heard me say this before, you already know the answer, but typically people will give me beautiful answers such as get rid of homework, be you, care about me, get rid of tests, get rid of grades, and all of the things that we see shared around the internet of all the things that educators need to do. And yet the truth that my students share with me every single time is much more simple. It's about the physical space that they're asked to inhabit from the moment they walk into our classrooms. And I've shared this before because every time it comes back up, and this often still comes up when I ask students this, I'm amazed every time. Out of all the things, this is what you want me to share with the world. And it wasn't until I took a moment and my students once again taught me that that's an easy one because this is the first thing you take away. And as we live and teach during this COVID time, I'm horrified at how many more things are being taken away from children. We're trying to police how they show up in our online classrooms, whether they're allowed to drink water, how they're supposed to sit as far as their posture, whether or not they're on camera. I think about how often and how quickly we take away without recognizing that that's what we're doing. It's almost embedded in us that we take and we control and we shape. And I think about all of the PD that we are exposed to that teach us better options for more control, better way to make sure that students act exactly the way we want them to. And we don't even blink and think about how this is going to impact the kids that we do this to. I remember when my oldest daughter, who's a rising sixth grader, was headed into kindergarten. And I had been blogging for a while by then, and I wrote a post where I said, I'm worried about her going into kindergarten because I'm worried about what silence and compliance is going to do to her. You see, Tia has always been rambunctious and creative. She's always been a kid that has loved to move, to dance, to act, to sing. And I didn't know how someone whose heart lies in movement and lies in connection, how they would do in kindergarten. I remember the backlash I faced after that blog post and how quickly people said, well, you don't even know the teacher yet. And I tried to explain my thinking, but what I know now, 7 years later, is that I didn't need to know the teacher because I knew the system that she was entering into. And that she could have an incredible kindergarten teacher, which she did on the second try after we moved her, who gave her a lot of freedom, who taught her what student-centered learning meant. And yet it didn't matter because the next year she could have a different teacher of a different philosophy. And that's why I think about how much we need to spread the word about the student agency that is forgotten in our classrooms. And I agree with with Jen, what she just said in the chat. Woke kindergarten, they are incredible, and the work that they share, they show us that we can give freedom and make liberation and power a central focus of what we do. That there's no age that all of a sudden kids would do better with control and freedom and space to be who they are. I know that we spend so much time teaching expectations, but when do the students get to teach us their expectations for us? Why is it so easy to dismiss what students think about us as long as we can control them. And so I come back to what my students have taught me throughout the years. A couple of years ago in 7th grade, I taught a boy, and he's the one who taught me this lesson. I had tried to once again give my classroom back to the students, but I wasn't quite sure that 7th grade was going to be where I fit. I missed 5th grade and having kids all day. I missed having my own students where everything was much more controlled and I felt like I was a part of the family. And yet this kid had this way of making me feel like I mattered in his life. At the end of the year, at this point, we did this, I believe, essay. And I was about to read his draft, and all he did was sit down and hand me the computer, and then he sat back and he looked at me, and I didn't know what he was writing about. This was the first time I laid eyes on any of his writing. As I started to read, I quickly realized that he had chosen this moment in our classroom to come out to his classroom as gay. And he was talking about how he believed that friendship, above everything else, was going to be the biggest difference in his life because his best friend had shown him what it meant to be accepted. I quickly looked up at him when I realized the weight of the story that he was going to share. And I said, "What can I do?" And he said, "Nothing. You already did it." And he pointed over my shoulder, and I looked back, and right behind me, there was a tiny little rainbow flag that I had put up on my whiteboard. He did his speech, and his classmates embraced him. I always had them write little notes. And then he went on to 8th grade, and he went on to high school. And I kept thinking about the boy who made me feel like maybe I should be a 7th grade teacher. And I wondered how he was doing because I knew he was in a hard emotional space. In April, he committed suicide. And I think about this all the time, that in that moment, he felt accepted, but something happened to where the world got to be too much and he only saw one way out. And it's not that I look back and go, what else could I have done? Because I know we did everything we could in that moment for that child. But I think about how often we lose kids. And maybe it's not through suicide. Maybe it's just that they shut down. They don't show up. They pull their hood up, or they tell us every curse word in the book, or they just roll their eyes, refuse to do our work. And I think about how often we switch to control when it comes to those situations, that maybe if I create a checklist, or maybe if I just create one more tool to get this kid to comply. And we forget that school is hard and that school can be unsafe. And sometimes we're the reason that a child feels unsafe. And I think about what Cornelius Minor has taught me, that we can use our physical environment to free or to oppress students. And often we're doing both at the same time. That often some kids feel freedom and liberation within our classroom, while others feel like there is no space for them to be who they are. That through our body language and through our language and how we label them and speak about them and the perceptions and assumptions that surround them, we are sometimes taking freedom away from children in a way that directly impacts them and impacts them for a really long time. And I think about that as I see policies and expectations being shared for what COVID teaching is going to look like, and how often it has to do with accountability. How will I know they're doing the work? How will I know that they actually did it themselves or that they're spending their time wisely? And what we forget to see is that a lot of these short-term solutions, because at some point we are going to go back to some kind of different way of schooling again, can do some really long-term damage. That when we tighten, sometimes we're actually choking. And it's the kids that end up bearing the brunt of that. And so I think about what Isabel's has told me a long time ago. She is now a senior this year. That when I asked her what my classroom should look like, And I meant, should I rearrange the furniture? Or are there things you need in the classroom within my meager budget? And many of the kids answered, a Starbucks, Mrs. Ripp, or a couch so we can nap. Isabel took the opportunity to say, once again, that it really wasn't about how it looks, but instead how it felt. That they should be able to say whatever they want as long as it's on topic. But I think it goes beyond that, right? That students need to know that in our spaces, whether virtual or in real life, that they can show up even on their worst days, and they're still going to have a chance with us. And that we're going to recognize them as a human being who is going to do their best, but sometimes their best is very different than other days. And so how can we somehow symbolize that in kids when we invite them into virtual classrooms? I've seen people create beautiful Bitmoji classrooms to do those things. And I have no problem with anything like that. In fact, I was just working on my own. I need one for my own school. But I think about that it doesn't matter if our actions don't follow that. We can put beautiful posters up on the wall, but kids can see right through us if our actions don't line up with that. How building community is not for the first week of school, but it's for the entire year. And that we're always trying to reach kids, and we're trying to reach them so that they can feel seen and valued and cared for, even when they don't want us to see them. And so I think about whose voices are missing. And I don't just mean in our classrooms, although my husband and I were just talking about it. He was in an in-service and he said it was great. They had some students speak about their hopes for the school year and what they didn't like about virtual learning. He goes, I just wish it hadn't been the class presidents. He goes, wouldn't it be cool to bring in one of those kids that didn't do very well with the remote emergency teaching, where school isn't a place for them? And I said, well, they have on other times. You just haven't been around for that. But I agree. Who is it we hand the microphone to? Is it really every kid or every kid's experience? Or is it just the ones that are going to make us feel good about ourselves? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be able to feel good about ourselves. There's a lot of things going right in education for a lot of kids. But we have to also see where the gaps are. Whose experiences are we not hearing about? Whose experiences are we dismissing because it hurts? Because it will hurt. I've yet to meet a teacher that didn't pour their heart into this work. And when you do that, you end up getting your emotions attached to it too. Teaching is personal. We go in there and we pour everything into what we do. And when kids don't see that, it feels like a personal slight, even though it might not be. Sometimes it is, though. But I also want to think about this question on a much larger scale. Whose voices are missing in our professional development? Whose voices are missing in our leadership teams, in our administration, in our classrooms? What about back to school night? What about the parent-teacher organization or the coaches? Who are the families that do not feel safe coming into our spaces, who don't feel welcome? And maybe we think we have it covered. Maybe we think that translating something into another language is enough to make people feel welcome, or maybe calling them rather than sending an email is enough to bring them in. But are we really digging into why sometimes we have incredibly predictable patterns of who shows up and who doesn't? Are we really going out into our community and saying, how can I help you feel safe? And I think about that we so quickly put our perceptions on those who do not show up. We are so quick to say, well, they never come because they don't care about school, when that may be so far from the truth. And the thing is, people know this. They know whether we really mean it when we say all are welcome, when we set up times that aren't accessible to those at home, when we set it up in languages that aren't accessible, when people feel judged the minute they walk in because maybe they had to bring their children along and we said that no younger siblings should come in, or maybe we tell them what the expectations are and they're late. I think about this because whose voices are missing, not just in our own classrooms, but in our entire life, is directly impacting the understanding we have of the world. And we can extend it. Who's missing at our dining room tables? Who is missing in our friendship circles? Who are the people that we've never had any kind of personal connection with in the lives that they have? Do we know people who look different than us, who practice different religions, who have different cultural heritage? Or do we just shut that out? And so I think about this a lot, and I keep thinking to myself, how can I make sure that all of my students have a way to express themselves in the best way possible where they feel safe? And while I would love for every child to feel comfortable sharing on the first day of school, I know that that's simply not going to be the truth. And so we can focus on tools, but we have to also focus on community. We have to have gentle conversations with the kids who don't feel like sharing and figure out why. And then the thing is, too, we have to grow thick skin. I think growing thick skin is something I'm still working on. Many teachers and adults probably are. It's a superpower I feel like my husband has figured out, and I just haven't yet. Because here's the thing. We're going to need to ask some hard questions. We're going to have to ask how they feel with us. Do they feel respected? Do they feel safe? Do they feel valued? Do they feel like what we do actually matters? Or is it just more of the same? And then we have to hide our emotions. We have to give ourselves a neutral face, because if we start acting up and judging right away, then you know the kids are going to shut down. We can't retaliate when something hurts. We are the adults here, and my hurt emotions are not as important as the reality of a child. I can certainly have follow-up conversations with kids, which is why I never do surveys anonymously, because kids need to learn to stand behind their words, but they also need to learn that when they do bring up their words, I'm not going to shut them down, even if they hurt. And I think about the child who on my end of the year survey wrote this to me when I asked, how was this year in English? And I remember the incredible sense of embarrassment. Like, how can I sit and teach other people? How can I write on my blog or my books or pretend that I know anything when this is the reality of a child in my room? And yet in his words is such a gift. And I recognized that when I had gotten over my own embarrassment and shame and pity. And I went back to him the next day and I said, thank you so much for sharing this truth with me. How can I make sure that this never happens to another kid? How can I make sure that English isn't the worst class that they've ever had and that I shouldn't even work here? And he took a moment and he looked at me and he said, Mrs. Ripp, it's not you. I thought to myself, I think it's me. And he goes, no. He goes, I don't like reading nor writing or mornings. You're really loud. And I thought to myself, whether this is true or not, right? Because there's a definite power discrepancy here. He gave me such a gift. I can't get too comfortable. There's always going to be a next step. And I wish I would have realized that a lot sooner in my journey as a teacher, that I can't wait around for anyone to give me permission to change how I teach. But I always say to people, if you're waiting for permission, I'm going to give you mine right now. Take a step. And then if it doesn't work, that's okay. Take another step. And also don't compare your journey to mine or to other people. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get on teacher social media and I feel like the biggest imposter and failure. And it's like, and I know that some people look at me and go like, man, she has it all figured out. And I'm over here going, no, I don't. I just changed my first day of teaching slides again for the 7th time. But that's the thing. We tend to look at others, and some people do feed into this myth, right, that they have everything figured out. That's not healthy. Because if we can't sit down and say, no, I don't, and I'm going to learn from other people, and I'm going to share ideas, but also be receptive to ideas from other people so that I can continue on this journey, then we should get out of teaching. But if we forget that students have to be a huge component of our professional development, then I think we've lost sight of what's really important. And so I think about this because I know for a long time I had to kind of figure out when my gut said, oh, you got to punish, like there's got to be some sort of consequence for this. I had to slow down That's why I got rid of my behavior poster and all of the, I had the sticks with the cups and I had the clip chart and I had to write the name on the board. I tried all of those things in my first couple of years of teaching. And you know what? It did scare a lot of kids. But the kids who really needed to work on how to function within a classroom, it just egged them on. If I said, write your name on the board, they wanted to write it as big as they could. And I think about that. I think about it when Tia, my oldest, again, came home in second grade. She had a fantastic second grade teacher, but she came home and she was crestfallen. And I looked at her and I said, what's going on? And she goes, Mom, I was on red today. And I said, what happened? And she goes, I don't know, but my teacher hates me. And I was like, that's not what red means, Tia. It means that you needed to change something that didn't change. And she goes, but you know what? She goes, no, yeah, maybe I was talking, but I don't think she likes me anymore. That's what she learned with that clip chart. I reached out to her teacher. It was from talking, and she just kept talking, which didn't surprise me, but it really impacted her. I also remember as a fifth grade teacher, I was at the last room before the bus. So I would see all the kids walk by as my own fifth graders were trying to leave. And there was this one kindergartner. And mind you, I did not teach kindergarten by any means, but he thought I was special. And so he would come around the corner and he would just be waving, hi, Mrs. Ripp. And he would tell me, I didn't even know his name. And he would tell me all about his day. I still remember when he was like, Mrs. Ripp, I wore my new shoes and I can't even walk anymore. But every day he had something to share. And one day he came around the corner and he goes, Mrs. Ripp, guess what? Guess what? And I said, what? And he goes, Peter was on yellow. And I was like, Peter? Who was Peter? Peter was one of his classmates. And I go, oh, yeah. And he goes, he's never been on yellow before, Mrs. Ripp. He's always been on red. And I thought to myself, it's November. This is the first time this child has been on yellow. And if this kindergartner is telling me, some random fifth grade teacher that he like connected with for some reason, who else is he telling? Is that kid now getting invited to birthday parties or parents sitting at home going, And so I think that when we have systems like that in place, we take away the opportunity to just sit in the moment and go, are you okay? Now, I'm not talking about if there's like physical violence, like typically if my students fight, which they do once in a while, I'm not standing next to them going, are you okay? I'm trying to stop the fight, but I'm thinking about when a kid does that thing and they hit us just right, that triggers something where we're so quick to be like, get out or go to the office or go sit over there or stop or whatever it is that our mouths and our reactions want us to react with. Slow down. Pull them outside. Are you okay? Because this doesn't seem like you. Even if this is the exact same thing that they have done every single day in your class, every day, tell them, are you okay? Because this isn't how I see you. And then listen, and then figure out a plan. I think about this a lot, if you follow any of my work, that who is it that gets to make bad choices in our classroom? How often are we quick to dismiss those kids over there? Because for the most part, they do pretty good. But then we are on some kids with a microscope. They can't take a step out of line, and we are right there to tell them. And then we create check-in, check-out sheets and behavior check-offs, and you wonder why kids tend to blow up more when they're put on plans like that in the long term. Could you imagine if someone had to rank your performance after every single period, every single day? If someone was actively monitoring whether you had your eyes on the text or you talked to a friend or did all those things that we sit and do in staff meetings all the time, would you feel safe? Would you want to change your behavior long term? And I'm not saying like don't use these things, but I'm saying keep the humanity of the child. Recognize when this is not the way to go. Because I know that sometimes we don't have other opportunities. We don't know what else to do. And this becomes a tool. But how often is it the same kid that gets the behavior chart, that gets the check-in, check-out, that gets the limited scope of what they're allowed to do? And so I think about who's allowed to speak, whose voices, whether spoken or written, is given power. Because it was never about giving or creating space for students. It was always about giving it back to them because we took it from them when we taught them in kindergarten to sit down, crisscross applesauce, and zip your lips. How are we giving space back to kids so that they can truly feel like their opinions matter? Because if you look at the research, this isn't exactly what's happening. And yes, this is really old research, but I've been in a lot of classrooms. I don't know if you have too. And I would say this is probably true even for my classroom, because I always have something, just that little nugget I need to make sure I insert, right? Or maybe my directions ran a little bit long because I got really excited, or maybe I'm echoing what the kids are saying to make sure the kids in the back heard it. There are so many terrible behaviors when it comes to teacher speak that is unnecessary. And what this does is that we end up with kids who walk through their days silent, whose only voices and interactions is asking to go to the bathroom or perhaps talking to a friend. And so as I think about this coming year, or whether the year has already started, which I know it has for some of you, I think about this question: how am I going to give the space back to my students? How can I make sure that in 7th grade they feel like they have the same space that maybe they got from previous teachers, or maybe this is the first time that they feel truly seen and heard on their premises, not on my fake intentions? And so I think about the structures that we put into place, and I was kind of collecting wisdom from my students throughout the year as I was thinking about this. You know, Tegan's words, which I said in May too, that we need to do our own work, because so much of what we sit and create is amazing and doesn't take very long until we actually try to do it. We also have to think about boundaries. I have loved my virtual in-service days because I didn't have to do icebreakers. I didn't have to get up and have awkward conversations with people that I do know. I've been at the school for 7 years, but it's just really hard. I could sit behind my screen and interact in a way that felt comfortable to me. And I think that this goes for our homework too. Think about when I, a 40-year-old woman, sit down to do my homework, and then I probably have to triple the time that it took me, at least for my average 7th grader, to do it. But it's not just there. It's also about the systemic labels that are placed on kids, such as grades. And I remember when Brooke said this to me, she wrote it in a survey and we had a follow-up conversation, and she was so adamant about it. It's just an opinion, Mrs. Ripp. I am the only one that knows how much I truly learn and whether I felt like showing it. And guess what? If I don't like you, I might want to show it. And I was sitting there wrestling kind of mentally with this 12-year-old, and I was like, but that doesn't make sense. Now you're setting yourself up for failure. And she's like, it does to me. And I was like, I get that, right? That grades are just an opinion. And we know that bias and perspective and racism plays into how we grade kids. And so I asked my students a few years back, here's your stage. What do you wish other teachers knew about grades? And that first one on this long bullet list really stood out to me because multiple kids said it. I don't control what grade I get. And I was like, what'd you do? This is supposed to be a reflection of what you're showing me and what you've taught me, or show me that you know. And they're like, yeah, but Mrs. Ripp, I work super hard sometimes and the teachers don't see it. And so I think about the missing conversations we're having with kids when it comes to some of these structures, when it comes to homework, when it comes to grades, when it comes to the systems that we have. Today in our in-service, we were talking about a fantastic curricular disruption tool created by Jess Lifshitz, who's another amazing educator in down by Chicago, and she's a 5th grade teacher. You should definitely follow her blog called Crawling Out of the Classroom. And one of my incredible colleagues said, we should hand this tool, this rating tool, to students and have them rate our units. And I think about that, how powerful that would be for students. And so there are so many things that can stand in a child's way of feeling safe with us. And the biggest one, of course, is safety and other inequities. Of course, motivation and access and executive functioning and all of these other things will stand in their way. But for me, in my experience anyway, it is usually things either beyond my control or things directly related to me that stand in the way of a child learning? How often do we dismiss that it may be the relationship that we have with a child that creates the barrier and the obstacle? Perhaps it's the expectations we have for everybody showing up, being 100% on and chipper and excited to be there, and whatever great participation looks like. Perhaps we haven't made space for the kids to just show up and sit and listen because that's what they need to do that day. And so I think about this a lot. What can we do to help students stay engaged or even become engaged in the first place? Because staying engaged, that's kind of on us as well. The first one is always, do they feel safe and valued? And then all of these other things are just thinking about tools that we can provide students. You know, my students said we'd really like more live check-ins or video check-ins. And I said to my students, do you want long-term projects or every day? And they're like, we kind of want both. You know, can they write their own learning plans, especially if they're older, but you can do this with young kids too. How am I going to learn these things? What are the tools in my toolbox to take control over my journey? I love the micro progression charts from Kate and Maggie Roberts. If you haven't seen those, give them to kids for examples, because so often when we show a kid an example, we show them what the finished great product should look like. But if a kid is sitting at the beginning of their journey going, I don't know what the next step is, we need to give them a chart that shows them all of the different steps so that they can see, oh, now I have moved into this next area of proficiencies. You know, put in study halls, mental health support, and of course, use your team. We're not alone. Even if we're sitting as an elementary teacher, just in charge of one group of kids, we are not alone. And so I think about my beliefs and how much my beliefs have changed and been shifted by the influence of other people who are more brilliant than I'll ever be, and how directly those beliefs shape the lives of the children I teach. How when I first read about perception research, I really had to sit with that for a moment and recognize that this is exactly what had happened in my own life, that I let assumptions wrap kids up in fake identities, and those assumptions became their identity because I made it so. I think about all of the incredible work that is being pushed out right now for free in many cases about anti-racist and anti-bias approaches and things that we need to do. And how grateful I am, because I know that the more I can learn, the more I can do. And so I think about Jason Reynolds' words here, posted on May 29th, after the president called Black people thugs once again, and how he so eloquently showed us what happens when we use dismissive and derogatory language. Because when I call someone a thug, I don't have to look at them as a human being. I can distill a person down to one identity that fits into my worldview and never see past it. And while we might not walk around and call our students thugs, we do call them low. We call them struggling. We call them, you know, behaviorally challenged or troublemakers or whatever side conversations we have about kids. And we don't see how permanent that becomes, how that becomes a child's entire label. Two of my daughters have IEPs for various learning needs. And I said to my husband today, actually, if someone ever called them low or struggling, and determined that their entire year was going to be hard before even knowing them, I don't even know what I would do as a parent, but it wouldn't be pretty. But it happens all the time. We do it all the time. I fall into the trap myself. And so I think about how I can continue to push my assumptions and my beliefs. And it comes back to that, whose voices are we missing? Lorena Geman from Disrupt Text talks about how our society is in grave need of teachers who will stand up for the truth, who will raise their voices, who will push back against practices they see harming kids. I have seen a lot of teacher activism this summer, and it has fired me up. But as we know, we've also seen a lot of teacher backlash here in the United States. It's the same old tired trope of how we're lazy and we don't really care about children because then we would all be going back. But I think about how I'm going to choose to continue to put my voice out there, despite the discomfort and sometimes even death threats that come my way on my blog. I woke up Saturday and someone who had a lot more Twitter followers than I'll ever had seen one of my tweets recommending Matt Kay's book, Not Light But Fire. And what followed was many followers calling me all sorts of things. But I giggled because one of the biggest insults was that they called me a socialist because I was apparently from Denmark, and we know how dirty those socialists are. And I just thought to myself, yeah, that's okay. I'd rather be a dirty socialist than a lot of other things. But I think about, too, this doesn't hurt me. Does it feel strange to wake up to strangers calling you names in your Twitter feed? Absolutely. But if I didn't want that, I could just make it private. And again, back to Jason Reynolds. How often do we dismiss entire identities of students because we've decided that the way they speak or the way they write, the way they walk, the way they dress is not proper or respectful? Because I see that word thrown around a lot in order to police children, in order to dismiss their identities. And I think about Jason Reynolds, who's one of our living children's authors right now, and yet how people still expect him to talk because surely he doesn't talk the way he writes. And how often this is what we expect kids to do, or we say dismissive terms when it comes to the dialect that they bring or the way that they speak. Well, I'm going to teach you how to write proper now. And there's so many others doing work around this that I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert on it, but I bring this into my own classroom and into my own practices. And I think, again, back to Cornelius Minor, that I can sit and spend a lot of time identifying systems that need to change, or I can start to do the work. And that starts with me. And it starts with the systems that I have created within my classroom. I think about my students when I was researching for one of my books. I think it was Passionate Learners. And I said, let's talk about the bad kids. How do you know who the bad kids are? And one kid said to me, well, the teachers tell us. And it stopped me. I was like, what do you mean? I said, do they give you a list? And he's like, no, we can tell, Mrs. Ripp. They yell at them or talk to them in a certain way. They take away their privileges. And I was like, well, I mean, certainly these kids are also doing things, right? So we have to. And they're like, Mrs. Ripp, that's not it, though. They're like, yeah, we know who the kids are that are going to come in and cause a ruckus, but we can also tell who the teachers don't like and the ones that they probably talk about. And that sat with me for a long time. The teachers tell us. And so I'm reminded that, how we work with our most vulnerable students, whether it's the most disengaged or the most disruptive or the kids that have the biggest learning hurdles to overcome to even come into school, that's going to show us and show the rest of the world what our vision truly is. Because I can certainly sit and flaunt beautiful test results and high graduation rates, but what about the kids that don't show up in those data pieces? How do I treat them when they walk into the office or when I have to send them out of the room or have to have some sort of conversation with them? Do they feel respect no matter what? I think about that when I've had the kid right in my face trying to get a rise out of me. And I've told him, this isn't going to work. And I always tell him, I have twins. You can't scare me. That's it. That was scary enough. And how we can keep being calm and keep being respectful even when it's hard. And this is the poster that if you were to ever come to Oregon, Wisconsin, and outside of COVID times, you're more than welcome if I'm still here. I love my school district, but we are looking at returning to Denmark if possible as a family within the next couple of years. So come to Oregon quickly. But this is the poster that hangs outside my classroom door. And I've said before, it's not so much for the kids. Maybe they glance at it and I get a quick smile out of it. It's for me. It's for me as a reminder that I am glad that the kids showed up the way they showed up today, that they're still welcome, that even if they're having a really awful day and they have decided that they're going to take it out on me somehow, that we're going to get through it together. That doesn't mean I'm going to be their doormat or their punching bag, but that we're going to create some sort of agreement to figure it out together. And hopefully they can see me as someone who can support them or get them to people who can support them. And I think about this, right? Because like I see a lot of things being shared online right now. Oh my gosh, I don't know if you're overwhelmed like I am about how like all the things I should be doing to be creating a beautiful environment right now and all the resources that are shared. And I keep thinking about that it just comes down to love. And it's so stupid, right? Like, of course we should love children. And yet I see educators who have long ago lost the love of kids. And I get why. After 13 years in this educational system and kind of being forced into this teacher as a hero myth, it is exhausting. And you almost forget about the kids and all of the to-dos and all of the things that we're supposed to do. And when you talk to teachers about why they left the classroom, how many of them say it was never the kids, it was everything else. So I hang on to this piece of love, and I don't mean in a creepy way, right? But just like in a, I love what I do, and I want those kids to feel safe and respected, even if they don't love my subject area. And I tell my students that, like, you don't have to love English. It's okay if that's not your favorite subject, but I want you to feel safe here. I want you to feel part of the community, even if you're like, man, I hate reading and writing and everything that Mrs. Ripp invents. So this is yeah. Augustine, my youngest, was born 10 weeks early. This is the first time Brandon and I got to see her. I think this was 5 hours after her birth. I promptly vomited after this picture was taken because I was not in a good space. Augustine came so fast that there was no doctor in the room. The nurse caught her as she came out as they were trying to do an epidural on me. She came so fast that I now know what that big red emergency button in the room does. When you hit it, everybody comes running. And she also came so fast that she didn't cry. And for probably the longest minute of my life, I didn't know if I was now the mother of 4 kids or of 3. And it wasn't until Brandon rushed back to my side and he goes, "We've got her, Pernille, and I'm going to go with her, but she's breathing." But I think I took a breath again. I was bleeding profusely, and they were trying to stop that for me, so I couldn't even focus on the baby that I just had. But I think about the week leading up to her much too soon arrival, how I remember on Facebook I had put like, wow, Braxton Hicks are starting really early this time. And 5 hours later, I was calling the midwife going, I don't think this is right. And 2 days later, I was admitted to the hospital where they realized that I was in preterm labor. I was at 29 weeks at that point, and they said, we need you to hold on because this is not good. And I stayed in the hospital, obviously, and the doctor from the NICU came down one night, and he goes, it was late, it was like 10:30, and he pulls up his chair and he goes, you know, if she comes and we don't want her to, we've got this. We've got the machines that will keep her breathing and the machines that will keep her warm and that will keep her fed. And we have all the machines that will monitor everything we can. But there's some things that we're not going to know, because when babies are born that early, they can only check for the parts of the brain and whether they're developed. They can't actually see if they function right. They can just see if the parts are there. And he goes, so for a long time, you're going to be holding your breath. And for every milestone, you're just going to hope that she's meeting it, because you just don't know how her brain is going to be impacted. Augustine was 3 pounds, or she was right under 4 pounds when she was born, and by 2 days later, she was at 3 pounds. She looks like a little tiny wrinkly man in our pictures, and there were times where we couldn't touch her because it would stop her breathing. There were times that any noise would also stop her breathing, and there were just times where we couldn't even be in the room with her because it was too much for her baby body to handle. But she grew and she cried, and we tried to grapple with what it meant to have 3 children under the age of 5 at home and a baby in the NICU. I also didn't have a maternity sub because my principal hadn't gotten that figured out. So I was also teaching at this time. I returned to school 2 weeks after her birth. But Augustine got released from the NICU, and we went home with an almost 5-pound baby on trial. I just found her papers, and they said Mom agrees to bring her back the next day if she doesn't gain weight. But she gained weight. And every time we took her in for a checkup, we would hold our breath. Finally, a couple years ago, we took her in for yet one more hour-long checkup with the PT and OT and nurse and all of the people that showed up for when your child is prematurely born. And the nurse says, we need to talk. And she sat us down and she goes, I have news. Augustine is perfectly average. I don't need my child to be gifted and talented. I don't need her to win awards. She could be perfectly average because you wouldn't know it looking at her now. She's about to go into first grade. She's excited about school, but doesn't want to go to school this way. She's like an evil genius who just discovered that if she left a spoon in the ice cream tub in the garage freezer, then every time she walked by that freezer, she could have a scoop of ice cream and Mom and Dad wouldn't even know. I think about this all the time because no one will know her story and how she was a miracle and how she beat the odds to now be perfectly average. I think about that all the time with our students, that I don't know what just happened before they walked into my classroom, or what happened last year, or what happened at home, or how they feel about people who look like me or act like me or talk like me, and how that's going to impact their actions right now. And so I think about that the only way that I can truly be the teacher that does embrace kids the way they show up is to seed the space, is to give them ways to impact me and impact each other in a way that actually makes sense. And that means less of me and more of them. Last week we were on a walk here in Wisconsin. We have the Epic campus here, which is like a crazy, huge medical company that does all these fairy tale buildings. And I thought about my kids and how much privilege they have, how much privilege their skin affords them, their socioeconomic status, the fact that they have 2 working parents, and what is viewed as the dominant narrative of normal family life. How I don't have to be afraid to send my kids to school. But some parents don't get that privilege. School is everything they fear, and yet it's the one institution that they also know can make a real difference in their lives. And I think about, even though my kids are wrapped up in privilege, how I still worry about sending them to school every year. I know how much a teacher can impact them, how much peers can impact them, and how long that damage can be to undo. And so I carry that with me into this year, not to paralyze me, but to push me forward, to think about how I can take responsibility for the actions and the decisions that I do make, but also open up a dialogue with those at home, letting them know that I'm here to listen and I'm here to learn. And that if I screw up, to please let me know, because that's the one way I can grow. I think we so often push out the idea of presumed positive intent and don't understand how that's actually just tone policing and cuts conversations off. How about you, of course, reach out to me, but maybe my intention wasn't even thought through. And so by saying it was positive, that means you're giving me too much credit at times. And so I want to end this month-long PD with not saying, here's where you can learn more from me, but instead, here's where other people you can learn from. I am so grateful for all of those doing incredible work right now, who are carrying the emotional toll of what it means to still 400 years after, and people were enslaved here in the United States, still trying to unravel the harm of racism and the long-term damage that it's done to our nation and society. And I'm so grateful for those who find the courage to stand up, even when people don't want to hear what they're saying. So I recommend that you follow all of these people, and notice that I put students and caretakers as number 1, because that's where it's at. So thank you for hanging with me tonight. I hope this was okay.